Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Work Department's webinar series this month on domestic violence. We have with us today Mrs. Amy Trabert. Her pronouns are she, her, and hers, and she is from the Erie County High Risk Team Coordinator. She is a licensed Master of Social Worker who is currently pursuing her Doctorate of Social Work at the University of Buffalo. She has been working as the Erie County High Risk Coordinator specifically focuses on preventing domestic violence homicide in Erie County while coordinating a multidisciplinary team. She graduated from Damien College with her master's in social work in 2018 and started her career working in child welfare and foster care practices as a data analyst and foster care recruitment specialist. After identifying severe violence and domestic violence issues in many of the she worked with, she took on a position as the high-risk team coordinator under Haven House of Child and Family Services. Trabert is currently in her second year of a 3-year grant that started in the beginning of 2018. Through her work, she trains law enforcement, mental health agencies, attorneys, and judges, medical professionals, and many other systems to talk about prevention and identifying high-risk factors while coordinating a team and caseload of identified high-risk clients in the county. So it is my pleasure to share with you Amy, and I'm going to hand it over to her at this point.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexis. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, especially for October because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So we actually have 2 more days of Domestic Violence Awareness Month at this point in time, and most of my time has been doing a lot of presentations. So I'm really happy to be with you here today. So what I'm going to go into is really some basic domestic violence 101, looking for the signs of abuse. And then what I'll get into later is the domestic violence high risk factors specifically for domestic violence homicide, because that is the clients and caseload that I'm really looking closely at. And I'll ask, just like Alexis said, I'll ask you guys a couple of questions. Feel free to put your answers in the chat box. There'll be a true and false part in the presentation as well. And then of course, I'll save time at the end for questions. I have all my contact information at the end, so you can feel free to reach out at any point in time. So let's get started. So I always give a content warning to folks. You know, I understand, and I put we because I'm usually doing this with one of my colleagues who's the high-risk team advocate, but we understand, right, that the material on domestic violence, homicide, and domestic violence overall can be distressing or triggering to individuals who participate. So at any point in time, take a break, leave the room, or do what you need to take care of yourself. And the nice thing is that we are on Zoom, so you have your camera off, you can step away, you can do whatever you need to do during this presentation if it ever becomes too overwhelming. So I just wanted to give you a little background about my job so then you can kind of understand where I'm coming from. I work for the Erie County High Risk Team. The High Risk Team, just like Alexis had mentioned, is funded by OVW for the Improving Criminal Justice Response Act. So we were given this grant actually way back in 2016, then got referred for another cycle in 2018. So I'm finishing up this grant next fall, and we're looking right now for funding for a couple. So what I wanted to focus on with you guys is to give you, again, some background about what I do. So from 2016 and 2019, I took over the role in 2018, but we've seen over 134 cases that were deemed as at high risk for domestic violence homicide. We saw an average danger assessment score of 24. The danger assessment score gives us an idea about how high risk the domestic violence situation is, meaning if it could lead to homicide. Anything 18 or over is considered extreme risk. The average score of my clients was 24. We saw that the average length of a relationship with clients was about 6 years. We received 17 different referral sources, so that's coming from either domestic violence agencies, mental health agencies, judges, attorneys, different things like that. And the one big thing that we realized as well is that 56% of the clients that we were working with had a child in common with the offender. And the reason why I bring this up is that domestic violence doesn't just impact the victim, it impacts the children and other people that are in the situation as well. So we not only should be thinking about, right, what are the resources for the victim in that situation, but what are the resources for the children or those family members that have also witnessed the violence. So this is the true or false part. Feel free to put this in the chat. This is for me to really just gauge where you guys are at when it comes to domestic violence education. You know, if you get it wrong, that's totally okay. That's why I'm here. So just some true or false. And again, you can put this in the chat box and I'll read it. So true or false, drinking or drug use causes battering or domestic violence. Battering is kind of an old term, still used by some people, but we now usually refer to it as domestic violence. So true or false? All right, so I got a false, I got a true, another true, another true, and another true. Cool, thanks guys. Thanks for participating. I really appreciate it. So actually the answer to this is false. Drinking or drug use does not cause domestic violence. It can exacerbate it, but it is not the root cause. The root cause of domestic violence is power and control. When a person is perpetrating, they're actually in the most control that they are in. What we see is perpetrators a lot of times like to blame substance use or alcohol abuse on the domestic violence that's occurring. So the big thing I do when I'm working with survivors or victims is telling them that just because somebody is going through either a rehab program or substance abuse program doesn't mean that the domestic violence is going to stop. It may look different, but it's not going to stop. So we talk about that really quickly with folks because again, the alcohol and drugs is not causing it. It can make it worse, but it's actually the power and control tactics that are causing it. Domestic violence occurs due to a victim's behavior, true or false? Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of falses come up. Yeah, that's completely false, right? We know with domestic violence, a lot of times perpetrators will make the victim believe that it's due to the behavior, right? A common phrase that I hear a lot in my work is, well, if you would have just made dinner on time, or well, if you would have just showed up when I told you to, or well, if you would have just listened to me, I wouldn't have had to do these things to you. Something to keep in mind, and that's gaslighting. And that's, again, trying to convince the victim, not only minimizing their abuse, but also trying to convince the victim that something's wrong with them. And that's really part of the psychological abuse that we'll go more into detail about later on. DV happens when a person loses control of his or her anger. True or false? All right, I'm seeing false, true. So DV happens and when a person loses control of his or her anger, that actually is completely false. When DV happens, that person is in the most control. The big reason and research behind this and how we figured out that it wasn't due to anger is we had many evidence-based anger management programs, and we were sending perpetrators to these anger management programs on a court menu through mental health agencies. And what we found out is they were completely unsuccessful. And that's because what we realized is that perpetrators don't have anger issues. They don't have problems with losing control. They have problems with giving up any control that they have. And they want control of all parts of the victim's life and in the situations that are happening. So they're not losing control, they're in the most control when domestic violence is happening. And so really the need for this community and the need in the area is finding interventions where we're really talking about the power and control aspects with perpetrators instead of focusing in on other issues, which is a whole separate issue. Mediation is an effective therapy for couples where domestic violence has happened. True or false? True, true, true. I think everyone put it in there. True, true, I'm saying true. Yeah, so that's actually false. Mediation is actually an ineffective therapy, and it's actually one of the most dangerous therapies for a couple to do where there is domestic violence has happened. And this goes along with couples counseling. Actually, mediation has been banned in court cases where domestic violence has been identified, and they do an assessment of that before custody and visitation, especially when coming to family court or integrated domestic violence court. And the reason why and the way I explain this is, think about it this way. You're in a therapy session with, say, social worker, counselor, whoever it is, psychiatrist, psychologist, and maybe during this time the survivor is being extremely vulnerable and is expressing and is exposing, right, the violence or psychological different forms of abuse that has been going on in front of the perpetrator, right? So it's those three scenarios. What do you think happens when they go home together at the end of that session? Any ideas? Yep, the abuse increases. It actually increases horribly and becomes very lethal. Because what happens is that the victim exposes what the perpetrator did not want to be exposed. The perpetrator lost control once somebody started to expose them in a session. So what we see is increase in violence. And what I'll note too is that I work with a lot of immigrant clients where they ask heads of institutions or religious institutions to mediate situations when it comes to marriages or relationships where there's domestic violence. And we have to talk and educate these officials on how that is completely inappropriate, ineffective, and extremely dangerous. Because putting on, right, and talking about the violence that's going on puts that client in more danger. So it's really important to understand this stuff. That's why when you're doing couples counseling, it's really important to screen out for domestic violence to make sure domestic violence is not happening in the situation. Therefore, it will not be successful and again, more dangerous. Batterers intervention programs can help cure an offender. True or false? And that's what they still call them, actually. They still call them batterers intervention programs, BIP. This is mainly in the court setting. Again, you'll see this in family court, integrated domestic violence court, sometimes Supreme Court. Yeah, you guys are right, false. If you notice, most of these have been false so far. Yeah, it's false. There's actually no cure for offenders. Right now, we view batterers intervention programs as accountability programs. So we don't deem them as effective therapies, and we don't deem them as being resulting in some form of change. It's equivalent to doing a program where it's basically psychoeducation about power, control, and abuse. And again, it's accountability. So it's forcing that perpetrator to keep going to those classes. I consider it kind of like jail for perpetrators in the sense that they have to keep going and attending classes to something that they don't want to be at. Unfortunately, we see that there's not too many successful models for batterers in the sense that we know, and we know this in social work, that in order for change to happen, you have to want to change. And many perpetrators do not see a problem with the power and control issues that they have. And that's why it becomes very difficult to change perpetrators. And this is not me to get, for you to lose hope in people or anything like that. That's me being very honest about the results and the recidivism rate. We know perpetrators most of the time, if they leave one victim alone, they're most likely, if they're not incarcerated, going on to a new victim. And again, that's because we don't have really great evidence-based programs available for perpetrators. What we do know to be the most effective is actually prevention programs and youth talking about anti-violence works, and also posing healthy relationships, what a healthy relationship and an unhealthy relationship looks like. That's what we find to be the most successful, because once adulthood is reached, perpetrators do not see a need to change because they've been doing it their whole life, so it becomes a little more difficult for change. And I have to have this conversation with clients, because a lot of times people will have false hope that there will be big change happening after they go to programs like the batterers intervention programs or a substance abuse program or seeking out mental health. Mental health is one component, but having power and control issues is a whole different component and arena. So it's really important that somebody is getting help for both of those things, not just one. The next true and last true and false question that I have is strangulation does not show marks 50% of the time. Yeah, so that's actually true. The only true one on here. Strangulation does not show marks 50% of the time. And people forget that. And a lot of my job is training law enforcement on that, is that just because somebody doesn't have marks on them doesn't mean that they were not strangled, essentially. One big thing to know about is I was able to work with the Strangulation Institute for some time, and what I found out is that the people that are most likely to show any types of marks are actually redheads due to their skin type. So the definition of domestic violence. Domestic violence is a pattern of coercive behavior where one individual uses fear and intimidation to gain and maintain power and control over their intimate partner. Right? The coercive behavior can be physical, emotional, sexual, psychological, and can include economic abuse as well. I'm going to go into some more examples of that, but sometimes with my clients, I see all components. I'll see one component. Just the other thing that I want to mention too is just because there isn't physical violence doesn't mean it's not dangerous. We've actually seen homicides that there wasn't any physical violence until actually they were killed at the end. So it's really important to know that psychological, emotional, although those are hard to prove, especially in cases with court, are real components and extremely dangerous as well. So I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but this is the power and control wheel. These are the different components that break down domestic violence. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you is that domestic violence refers to anything family-wise as well as intimate partner violence. So you might hear IPV, that's intimate partner violence. So that means there is a relationship between the two, either meaning physically, some type of emotional relationship going on, but it also can be familial, right? So if a son or daughter is perpetrating against a mother or father, an aunt is perpetrating against a child is perpetrating an aunt, right? It can go both ways. And sometimes people get confused with that. It's really important to understand the difference when working with clients, so that I've worked with clients where they've said, I don't think this is domestic violence abuse because it's my aunt, it's not my boyfriend. It's domestic violence abuse. This is a related matter. The other thing is same if somebody's a stepchild or a half sister, something along those lines. People have said to me, well, we're not blood related, so it's not domestic violence. That's not true. So again, anything that where somebody's a family member or part of a family, domestic violence is included in that definition. So using intimidation, right? So making, and they use her in here because we know 85 to 95% of clients identify themselves as females. So that's why they use those pronouns in there, but I will get to LGBTQ IPV folks as well. So making her afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying things. The biggest example of I had with intimidation is I had a perpetrator who used to clean his gun every time a victim had come into the room. He never said anything verbally, but that in itself was intimidation being used. Putting someone down, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names, making them think that they're crazy, playing mind games, saying they're not good enough. I also want to note some of the examples of this. So when we're talking about making someone feel bad, that can even go to like, you never make breakfast right, or you never tell me the right things that I need to hear, or something along those lines where you're hearing this constantly going back and forth, those are all signs of emotional abuse. Making you feel guilty for something that you shouldn't feel guilty about, right? So, you never tell me things, or you never tell me about this certain event that's going on, right? Those are some examples of emotional abuse. The other thing is telling someone they're not good enough, they're not pretty enough, they're not smart enough. You're always stupid. Oh, you never know anything. Your jokes are never funny. Nobody likes you. Like things like that, right? Something that you would deem as maybe bullying as a child, but you're seeing this in your partner. Using isolation, controlling what that person does. I have a client right now where she's not allowed to go to the bathroom without FaceTiming her perpetrator because he believes actually that she will cheat on him if she goes to a different room than him. So she has to FaceTime him. Not only is that isolation, but that's complete use of jealousy as well. So, right, controlling what that person does, what they see, who they talk to, where they read, where they go to. We saw with COVID that a lot of perpetrators were not allowing victims to watch TV, so they wouldn't know what's currently going on in the environment and in the community. So they were telling lies like, oh, you can't even go outside. Everyone's in lockdown. You can't even move. You can't go to the grocery store, right? So a lot of lies, not allowing them to wash their hands, not allowing them to use hand sanitizer, some of those power and control tactics as well. Limiting, how much they can go outside, limiting their social activities. A lot of times perpetrators, will say, what, your friends are really, really annoying. They don't like me. Why don't we hang out with my friends? Or, why don't we stop hanging out with them? Those are some of the conversations that start really that isolation. So if you start to see that, again, another sign. Other things of isolation is really perpetrator again saying, your family doesn't like me, your family's never liked me, they're annoying. Remember when they called you out on that stuff? They don't like you. They're mean to you, right? So isolating and taking them away from family members to the point where they no longer have relationships with these people. So maybe when they are thinking about leaving, they feel like they don't have an out because they don't have any relationships at this point besides with the perpetrator, or maybe perpetrator's friends. The interesting thing about perpetrators and perpetrators said friends is they're usually perpetrators as well, meaning that they will back up the perpetrator about things that they are saying, so the victim believes the things that they are saying are true. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, right? Making light of the abuse. I didn't hate you. You're crazy. That was a light tap. You're crazy. Saying the abuse didn't happen. Yeah, I never did that. You're lying. Shifting the responsibility for abusive behavior, saying that they were the reason that caused it, you deserved it. Concerns about taking it seriously. So I usually have my good friend Linda Dynell, who's a survivor, and she wrote the book Leaving Dorian. I highly suggest read it if you haven't already. She's on to her second book. She talks about how she tried to sit her ex-husband down and talk about how she thinks that they need to get a divorce. And he said, I'll slit your throat and take the kids with me if you ever try to do that, right? So all those types of things, right? Like your concerns mean nothing to me, and then a threat coming from it. Using children. We had a survivor whose perpetrator would actually rip his shirt up and then go to the kids and tell them that the survivor had done that. Okay, so there's a lot of ways that you can manipulate kids, especially with custody and visitation. Perpetrators are really good at doing that. Using malprivilege. We used to have a client that had to refer to her partner as Sir and King because he came, again, he thought he had all the power and control and was using malprivilege against that client. Economic abuse, not allowing them to spend money on certain things, not giving them the credit card, only giving them the credit card for certain things, saying they can only buy a certain amount of items, things like that is economic abuse. Coercion and threats. The biggest thing that we see a lot is, if you leave me or if you break up with me, I don't know what I'll do. I'm going to kill myself, right? So we see those threats a lot. Know that perpetrators mean that, and that's also a high risk factor for murder-suicide as well. Making her and asking her to drop charges if charges were pressed, making her do illegal things. We see a lot of perpetrators that will actually force survivors into substances. Meaning that, maybe they're smoking marijuana and they'll say it's just marijuana, but they've laced it with fentanyl, and then getting a survivor addicted, doing that purposely so that they appear less credible if they do ever try to report something. That's a big problem right now. So this is the power and control wheel for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans relationships. So it looks a little bit different. Emotional abuse. The big thing is outing. Outing is a huge threat involved with LGBTQ plus folks. The other thing that I wanted, to say is, the big thing that we'll hear too is that perpetrators or whoever's in the relationship will say, well, it's not domestic violence because males can't be perpetrators to other males. Or, oh, it's not a domestic violence situation because females can't be perpetrators to other females, which is not true at all, right? It's again based upon the relationship. So all of this is domestic violence. Saying that, all these different things, again, that you're not capable of doing things. I'm going to let your family know about this. Intimidation can look a couple different ways, right? Using homophobic gestures, homophobic behaviors. The big one that I said was outing. And then using privilege, so treating somebody else like a servant, and discrediting them as well. You're not a real lesbian, you're not a real gay man, different things like that. So these are the domestic violence statistics. Like I mentioned before, I try to do a better job of using they, them when pronouns when talking about survivors, but we do know that majority of victims are females, and that's the majority that are reporting as well. So 85 to 95% of victims of domestic violence are women. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men aged 18 or older in the US have been the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 19 men in the US have been a victim of stalking at some point during their lifetime. I'll talk a little bit more about stalking later too, in which they felt fearful or believed that they or someone close to them would be harmed or killed. Intimate partner violence, so IPV specifically, affects more than 12 million people every year. We know that homicide is the 7th leading cause of premature death for women in the US, and we know about 50% of these are done by intimate partners. The US Advisory Board on Child Abuse and Neglect suggests that domestic violence may be the single major precursor to child abuse and neglect fatalities in this country. So when I was talking to you guys again, we have to think about the kids. This is why. And I work very closely on the high-risk team with Child Protective Services. We're a multidisciplinary team. So we work with parole, probation, child protective services, the district attorney's office, and we're all talking about these things to get the victim connected to services that they need. DV occurs in every racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, age, sexual orientation, relationship, or group, right? Domestic violence does not discriminate. The biggest thing that I've heard people say is, oh, Amy, it's a city problem. Well, that's not true, because in Erie County, we had 14 domestic violence homicides last year. 6 were in the city and the rest were all in suburban areas. Okay, so that's something really important to know. We also know that domestic violence has increased in rural areas due to the lack of resources. So an increase in resources decreases domestic violence homicide. When talking about clients, my youngest client that I just had was 19. Oldest client I have is actually 65. So these are college student statistics, and I included this because you guys currently are college students, and this can be impacting family members, friends, or anyone that you're coming encounter with. 38% of college students say that they don't know how to get help for themselves if they've experienced dating abuse as a victim. That's my biggest concern, is that people aren't aware of the resources. So I do not live in your county. I do not live in your area. However, I, at the end, provided 24/7 resource numbers and numbers that can be used anywhere in New York State for your benefit. But it's really important to become aware of the resources that are available in your area, especially if you're going to be a social worker. I guarantee you, no matter what field you go into, you will come across a domestic violence survivor. And part of our social work ethics is being able to provide those resources appropriately. So it's really important that you know how to basically refer someone out if they need those resources. Over half of all college students say it's difficult to identify dating abuse. So a lot of people have issues with identifying what it looks like specifically. I do a parenting after violence class. I don't run it, but I come in at one point in the class and I talk to them about high risk factors. And a lot of them had told me that they wish they knew what they know now when they were younger, because they didn't know what they were getting into was unhealthy. And that's why most of the work that we know is super effective these days is prevention work, and letting our clients know this and letting our friends know this and making them aware of the symptoms and signs of abuse. 58% of college students say they don't know what to do to help someone who is a victim of dating abuse. Again, this is a resource problem, and it's not because there's not resources out there. There are resources out there. It's literally not having, not being able to identify, and a lot of people aren't educated on the resources that are available. Nearly 1 in 3 college women say they've been in an abusive dating relationship. These are IPV statistics specific to LGBTQ folks. So we know that LGBTQ people experience similar, if not higher rates of IPV compared to their cisgender straight counterparts. Transgender women who experience IPV were nearly 2.5 times more likely to experience sexual violence, and nearly 4 times more likely to experience financial abuse than those who did not identify as transgender. Gay men were 2 times more likely to need medical attention and 1.5 times more likely to suffer injury as compared to those who did not identify as gay. A third of the LGBTQ specific IPV cases reported to police, the survivor was arrested instead of the abuser. So, right, we go into that question of, why don't they just leave? Well, this could be why, because every time they report, they're accused of being the perpetrator. I have an example of this. We actually, in a suburban area in Erie County, a police officer had shown up. It was 2 males, so a same-sex relationship. And the perpetrator actually in size was quite smaller than the other male. And so what the police officer said to the victim, who was in size bigger than the perpetrator, is, I don't get it. Why don't you just beat him up back? Right. So, people wonder why, people don't report these things. And that's one of them. Size has nothing to do with it. And again, it goes back to stereotypes. It goes back to discrimination and the things that people face. 44% of lesbian women, 61% of bisexual women, and 35% of heterosexual women experience rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 26% of gay men, 37% of bisexual men, and 29% of heterosexual men experience rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. So, if not hearing the definition, these statistics really speak out about how it's impacting all groups, no matter what and no matter how they identify. So signs of abuse, right? So what are some signs of abuse? So these are just signs of domestic violence and potential abuse in general. And the next 2 slides, I'll talk about specific to domestic violence homicide, meaning we know somebody's in extreme danger of death that could occur. So signs of abuse, accuses you of having an affair. Fun fact, perpetrators often are the ones that are having the affair, even though they accuse the victim of having an affair. So something to keep in mind. Blames you for the abuse, right? Based upon your actions, based upon something you have done. Criticizes you, right? Feeling like you never do anything right. Feeling like you never could make that person happy, feeling like you're not good enough after having conversations. But what I say to people with relationships is, relationships are supposed to be a time of happiness, right? So if you're constantly feeling like in your relationship that your partner is belittling you or you're just not happy, that's a sign in itself that it's an unhealthy relationship. Tells you what to wear, how you should look, who you can talk to, who you can't talk to, where you can go. Don't wear that skirt, I don't want guys screaming at you for attention. I'm the only one who gets to look at you. I'm the only guy that gets to talk to you. That kind of stuff. The possessiveness is huge. Threatens to kill you or someone close to you, right? Saying, I will kill you. Or other family members if you try to break up with me, or if you don't have sex with me, or if you don't continue doing what I say. Throws things, punches walls when angry, right? So maybe a fight is going on, maybe it starts off as a verbal fight and objects are being thrown, punches the wall, seems like they are extremely mad when you try to bring up some types of points of how the relationship is going and how you don't feel validated. When you do that, abusers feel like you're taking away their power. So that makes them extremely, extremely mad. Yells at you and makes you feel small, right? Putting you down, constantly belittling you. A lot of times, survivors are very quiet and don't speak as much as usual because every time they did talk, they were put down. You know, and the other thing is, are you afraid? Are you afraid to say no? Are you afraid to say no to your partner, right? And if you do say no, do you feel guilty about it, right? So some of those things, again, are signs of abuse to keep in mind. A lot of this comes around sex. We know forced sex is very common for domestic violence situations. Right? Are you afraid to say no to sex? And if not, do you say yes only because you think bad things are going to happen if you don't say yes? So those are, again, things to keep in mind. So these are specific risk factors for domestic violence homicide. Again, this is specific to domestic violence homicide, but is also included in other domestic violence situations and events as well. Stalking behaviors. We know that 75% of cases there was stalking that happened in a domestic violence homicide. And when I'm talking about stalking, I'm no longer talking about somebody following someone in the store, which still happens, but I'm talking about technology, pure technology. So Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter. A lot of my safety planning that I do with survivors in the cases is surrounding technology. We've seen car trackers. You know, if you've ever shared your iCloud account or you've ever shared your Wi-Fi or your password, you know, that's free access to these perpetrators, and they will make your life miserable with it. A lot of perpetrators we know will create fake accounts, will make spoof calls, so they'll change their voice. Extremely hard to prove in court because of the spoof, and if their phone number doesn't show up with it, and not being able to verify that it is them, even though we know it's them. And being aware of your location, right? All these apps these days are asking for your location. Hey, is it okay for me to use your location? Be aware of that, right? Safety wise. With victims, we have to go through their phones and, you know, start new accounts, delete things, change passwords, make sure all locations are off, potentially getting a new router to get new Wi-Fi, Facebook, changing their Facebook, deleting their Facebook, checking who their friends are. We know perpetrators pretend to be like grandma or Aunt Betty or something like that, and then they accept it, and then it's the perpetrator chatting them. So those are all things to be aware of. And if your, you know, partner is really putting pressure on you to give them your password or give them information or privacy information, that's another sign as well. Or what, you don't trust me? Really looking at that stuff. Victim believes the perpetrator is capable of killing them. We know survivors rarely overestimate the amount of danger that they're in. We know that most of the time they underestimate the amount of danger that they're in, and that's not because they're dumb or stupid or they don't know. That's a survival tactic. That's how they're able to go through all this trauma and survive, right? These are pure survivors we're looking at. And in order for someone to move on day to day with abuse, they have to minimize it, right? They have to. Physical, and if a victim reveals the perpetrator is capable of killing them, believe them, right? Believe them, validate them. Physical abuse is increasing in frequency or severity. So once maybe started out as pushing, shoving, is now turning into strangulation, physical beatings, throwing down the stairs, different things like that. Again, the frequency and severity is very important. So maybe this only happened once, and then looking forward, it starts happening a couple times a week, sometimes multiple times in a day. We do a calendar with our survivors to really have them track and see what's been going on with the domestic violence events. And this isn't to re-traumatize them. We actually find them feeling empowered when they do that because it helps them really refocus in on some of the memories that have happened in the past. The other big thing to realize too is, again, physical abuse is not the only thing that matters in domestic violence. There's so many other components, like we mentioned before, with the power and control wheel. So strangulation from your partner, also called choking. So once somebody is strangled, they're 7 times more likely to be killed by that person that strangled them. And the one thing that I wanted to talk about and ask you guys is, does anybody know the difference between strangulation and choking, medically speaking? Yes, no? Any guesses? Strangulation result in death and choking does not. So the difference between strangulation and choking is that strangulation is any external force that's cutting off the oxygen blood flow from the neck to the brain. And then choking is any internal force that is cutting the oxygen flow of air and blood to the brain. So the best example that we have of strangulation is the most common way actually in domestic violence is with the forearm against the wall. You also can strangle someone technically with your foot. So if they put their foot on somebody else's throat, that's strangulation. Strangulation can be done with an object, a scarf, anything like that, rope, manually with the hands, behind the back. 99% of the time in domestic violence, it's going to be strangulation. Victims often will not say strangulation. Most of the time, they will say choking, and that's because just like most of people in society, they don't know the difference. For some reason, we really messed up the difference between the two, and people find it very confusing. But that's medically the difference, and it's important to educate our clients and others about the difference. Choking is internal, so the best example that I have of choking is a piece of food or a foreign object that's stuck in the throat. Choking and strangulation both can lead to death. So it doesn't have to do with that. I think out of all the cases I've seen, I saw one case where it was actually choking, and that's because the perpetrator was stuffing tissues down a victim's throat. And that was the only time I had seen it. But most of the time, like I said, victims will identify it as choking. Also, when speaking with victims, I found out that they use choking because choking sounds less severe than strangulation as well. And a lot of people think strangulation has something to do with leading to death. You know, fact, they both can lead to death very soon. So you'll see a timeline of that too. Offender has access to weapons or weapons are present in the home. So maybe the perpetrator doesn't necessarily own a weapon, but they have family members that like to hunt. Maybe they're affiliated with a gang that has weapons. Maybe they have friends who have weapons, besides just owning a weapon themselves. The offender is suicidal and threatened to kill themselves. This is not only a high risk factor for domestic violence homicide, it's a high risk factor for murder suicide, meaning that the perpetrator will not only kill the victim, he'll kill himself immediately after, resulting in two deaths. It's also a red flag for familicide, meaning that the perpetrator not only will kill the victim, but will kill other family members or other people present and then themselves at the end. Recently separated from the offender and has left the home where they resided together. A lot of times I get that question of, right, and I'm sure you guys maybe have asked it too, why don't they just leave? You're at greatest risk for domestic violence homicide when you leave your perpetrator. You're at greatest risk for domestic violence homicide when you leave your perpetrator, because it is a sign to that perpetrator that you are not coming back, and they essentially are losing all power and control. So it doesn't mean that people can't leave safely. People leave safely all the time. It just means that they need to be connected to an advocate that can strategically safety plan with them and do it appropriately. And a protective factor is actually never living with your offender. So if you don't live with your offender, that's a protective factor for domestic violence homicide. Other risk factors: offender is trying to kill the victim, offender is unemployed. The reason for unemployment is that you essentially have a full-time stalker. You have somebody that has all the time in the world to stalk you, to perpetrate against you, to think of new ways to harm you. This goes along with people that are quote unquote self-employed. We talk about perpetrators that are self-employed usually are involved with some type of human trafficking, drug trafficking, illegal activity. Offender has access or ways of obtaining a gun, weapon. We talked about that. For sex, we know that around 97% of victims experience forced sex. And again, that has to do with feeling like they can't say no. Maybe they had said no and then they're still forced to do it. Right? We never ask someone, hey, have you been raped by your partner? We never ask that. You can ask about forced sex, or you can ask in this way. I always say, has your partner ever made you do something that you did not want to do? And that's when I usually start to get a head nod or something like that. And then I say, did any of this involve sexual activities, right? Did you ever feel like you couldn't say no when engaging in sex? Did you ever feel like you had to say yes? Because if you didn't, something bad would happen to you or family members, or you would be threatened. That's the way that I ask it. Never ask somebody, right? It's not trauma informed to ever ask somebody if they've been raped. Offender threatens victim with a weapon directly, so saying, I'll kill you with this gun, I'll kill you with this knife. Extremely controlling. We talked about that being a huge factor, right? Controlling all aspects of their day, tracking them using a car tracker. If you guys ever heard of tiles, the thing that's used to help you find things, perpetrators put that actually in person linings of victims so that they can track them at all times. Offender threatens the victim with a weapon. Stepchild is present in the home. And a lot of times people ask me, why is that a high risk factor? And when I say stepchild, I mean it's a previous, a child from a previous relationship, or a child from a previous anything, meaning that it's not the perpetrator's child. So that child's a constant reminder that that perpetrator, that victim has essentially slept with someone else, and they don't like it. Because in their mind, the victim should only have slept with them. And they weren't able to control them during that time. So not only is it extremely dangerous for the stepchild, but it's also extremely dangerous for that other parent figure. So whoever's in it, those are constant reminders to the perpetrator that, again, they didn't have power and control in that situation. So we safety plan around both. Offender has broken through the window or door to get to the victim, meaning that they'll get to the victim at any point that they can. Even if an order of protection is issued, they don't care. They'll go through the door, they'll go through the window. We know, thanks to OPDV's fatality review that came out in 2019, that this is a new high risk factor for DV homicide. So characteristics of offenders that we know about: having access to weapons, less than a high school education, and being unemployed. It has nothing to do with race, ethnicity, age, or sexual orientation. And research shows us this. We talked about the difference between strangulation or choking. The other thing that I wanted to mention, right, that we talked about is 50% of the time there will be no marks. Within 5 to 10 seconds, somebody can go unconscious from strangulation. It's really important, if you know somebody's been strangled, or right, they're identifying it as choking, that they seek out medical attention immediately, that they're monitoring their symptoms. The other thing is to be checked out no matter what, even if they're not showing symptoms that they have been strangled. A lot of times it can be due to neurological damage, so they may not be experiencing symptoms at the time, but there's still a lot of damage with it. The other thing that happens with strangulation or choking is delayed fatality. So if I have a victim that maybe got strangled decades ago, I still and never got checked out, I still have them go seek out medical attention, because delayed fatality is a huge symptom to strangulation. We know that people that experience strokes, women under 45 who experience strokes or seizures, most likely have some type of history of strangulation or choking. So it's very serious, right? Defecation can happen within 30 seconds. Petechia in the leg, eyes, other body parts, red dots. So the bursting of blood vessels is what petechia is. So that's red dots in the eyes. Can be underneath the eyelids, behind the ears, in the scalp, even in the legs sometimes, and in the legs and in the scalp and behind the ear. Sometimes that looks like a bunch of red dots together, but it also can look like bruising. Loss of memory, PTSD. A lot of times with strangulation, people bump their head. Also, traumatic brain injuries are extremely common with survivors. So the one thing that I definitely wanted to give to you guys is the 24/7 resources that I have on here. So these are the New York State 24/7 hotline numbers, the National DV hotline, and then the National 24/7 text helpline. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you guys before I get into my contact information, or if people have questions, is that some of the things that you can really do in helping your clients or family members is, one, validating someone when they reveal to you a domestic violence situation or event, right? Saying, thank you so much for sharing this. I believe you. Thank you for letting me know that this is going on. Thank you for trusting me. All those things along those lines are huge. providing information, providing resources in the area for help, talking to them about right, what unhealthy or healthy relationships look like, asking how can I help, reflecting back to them that this sounds like an extremely difficult situation and that you cannot even imagine what they're going through. Because even, you know what, even if you're a survivor yourself, it's never appropriate to include your really your story, because everyone's story is different unless you find it necessary in certain occasions. But what I know is that every story is different. I mean, we never want to minimize somebody's experience, and it's so important to validate it, right? Reflecting the risk as well, saying it sounds like you're in a very dangerous situation. You know, how can I help moving forward? Or here are some resources that I have. It sounds like you're really unhappy right now in this relationship. What steps are you going to be taking moving forward? Putting that in their hands, right? Putting those questions in their hands. The other aspect of it is we find motivational interviewing to be extremely helpful with survivors because it empowers them to make a choice for themselves for the first time in their lives. Most of the time, survivors have been told what to do. So when we give them choices, they're able to make that decision on their own and guide them doing that. This is all of my contact information. So if you guys ever have any questions, you're looking for resources, you want to reach out, please, please, please reach out to me. I do a lot of technical assistance. I'm always looking to help other people, and let me know. I'm not a 24/7 outlet. I work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, but anything during those hours would be great.
So I just wanted to say thank you, Amy, so much. And she really means it. She's like the Energizer Bunny. She has so much energy and she's always helping people. So if you do have questions, email her and reach out. I am going to stop the recording now and to allow for more questions to be asked without that being included in the recording. So please stick around for that. And again, thank you, Amy, so much for this presentation. It was really informative and really appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I love doing this. I love talking with folks, especially anyone going in the field. So if there's any questions, please let me know. I'd be even happy to connect you to services that I know in the area or stuff that I can find out. But again, always happy to answer questions.